I would like to introduce with great pride my friend and I dare say colleague, Mr. James O'Keefe.
Thank you, Stefan. Wow. Recoiling from the truth. Okay. Well, what an event, what a great group of people. Donors, media, friends, colleagues, people who've been in trenches with me. Most of our undercover people are not here tonight for good reason. But I suppose Stefan pointed out that I've been undercover, so I am the exception. So I am the author of this book, American Pravda. And I'd like to give a few remarks tonight that relate to some of the material and concepts in the book and why I wrote it. So I'll talk about a little abstractly here why, and then I'll get into some of the reasons. Our framers created a government that exists with the consent of the governed, but that consent must be informed, not, as Noam Chomsky said, manufactured. The First Amendment makes possible all processes which make all the other rights in our society possible. But there is a contention about who's protected by the First Amendment in this country. In fact, they'll say, well, James, you're not a journalist. We at Veritas have an infinite faith in the power of free people. If we give them information, the right things will happen. People will deduce. You don't need to tell people what to believe. You just need to show them the truth. And things will kind of happen where they will be. George Orwell, who I quote extensively in this book, wrote that journalism is printing what somebody else does not want printed. Everything else is called public relations. So I just want to talk to you a little about what happened like today and this week to prove Orwell's point. This week we launched undercover videos into Twitter. 4 videos. The first showed that they could take your private direct messages and give them to the Department of Justice, the president's private direct messages. The second video showcased what they called shadow banning, where they could actually take information that you're tweeting out to your friends and they could censor it, silence it, suppress it, and mute it without you knowing. And everyone suspected this to be the case. Attorney General Jeff Sessions once pulled me aside and said, James, you confirm suspicions. That's what we do. We suspected this was the case, but no one was ever able to prove it. Third video, they have hundreds of engineers at Twitter that go through your direct messages and voyeuristically browse them, looking at pictures of your private parts. So we do all this. Twitter responds aggressively. No one in the media cares, except for day 4. Twitter responds aggressively and says, quote, we do not proactively review DMs. Absolutely not. Headlines in major media, and I'm going to read you the headlines in the mainstream media in reaction to our investigation. First, quote, Twitter says no. Hundreds of Twitter employees are not reading your DMs. Twitter says no. Okay. Second one, headline. Twitter denies claims they are reading your private messages. So they're quoting what the spokesperson says. TechCrunch. Twitter hits back again. It claims that its employees are monitoring direct messages. BuzzFeed got in the action. Charlie Warner said, quote, Twitter disputes the claim from O'Keefe's video. It's not my claim, BuzzFeed. It's the claim of the senior network security engineer in the video. It's his words, not mine. But you see a theme here. This is the problem with the media. We're being treated as though we invented this stuff. I'm just quoting other people. And they just blindly report what people tell them. Today, the Columbia Journalism Review, I was walking into this reception, tweeted, quote, how to avoid being investigated by Project Veritas. Interesting how an investigative journalism periodical is now actively coaching fraudsters and bad actors on how not to get caught. I mean, you have to stand in awe of the irony, or do you? I don't know. It seems to me more not about illumination, but circling the wagons. And this guy, Noam Chomsky, and many of you, O'Keefe's going to quote Noam Chomsky. Yes, I am. Noam Chomsky described modern mass media as an effective and powerful ideological institution that carries out system-supported propaganda functions. It's not really a left or right thing. It's just the system, the preservation of the status quo. So you may ask, what went wrong in journalism? Well, that's what this whole book is about. It traces back through the 20th century what has happened. Now, I recently went to go see this movie, The Post. with Ben Bradley, portrayed by Tom Hanks, and half of me sort of threw up in my mouth a little bit. But, I wish, well, I won't even get into it. And Ben Bradley stands up and sanctimoniously says, if we don't hold them accountable, who will? Right? And that was like a moment where I feigned a tear. But that was the Washington Post of old. That was 50 years ago. And oh, how times have changed. Hundreds of years ago, it was thought that people needed to be told what to believe, to be instructed. There was a sort of conflict of visions in journalism and information. Walter Lippmann, the founder of American journalism, called it the manufacture of consent. Due to the stupidity of the average man, there needed to be an organ of popular government, aka the media. Things need to be fit into neat stereotypes, structured. People need to be given the information. Contrast that to the view of progressive muckrakers throughout the 20th century, which I wrote about in this book, American Pravda. Upton Sinclair, these types of people, independent folk heroes who could not be bought or sold. We have German television here in the audience who interviewed me, and I talked about Günter Wallraff. Legendary reporter Günter Wallraff actually went undercover into a newspaper, The Bild, the third largest in America. And some of the techniques that Günter utilized made our techniques look like the Cub Scouts. It was pretty hardcore what these reporters did, but they believed in something. Three things: to tell the truth and shame the devil. The journalist must do whatever it takes to get into that palace guard, bribe, seduce people, lie, anything to break through. Tell the truth and shame the devil. The media would have you believe that Veritas targeting CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Twitter is a radical move. But legendary reporter Günter Wallraff infiltrated the Bild as an undercover journalist. He said, quote, "The task is to deceive in order not to be deceived." He said to break the rules of power, to break the rules of the game in order to disclose the secret rules of power. It's not radicalism. It's what Abby Hoffman, no right-winger, characterized as a form of guerrilla journalism. Günter Wallraff faked a resume and infiltrated the Bild, the world's third largest newspaper, writing articles with a worker-oriented slant. He had an agenda, which is fine. It's okay if you have an agenda, as long as you report the facts accurately. And he exposed an internal directive amongst reporters to launch, quote, "a strong attack on any attempts to extend worker participation in factory decision-making." Upton Sinclair also had an agenda. He didn't care about the rotting meat. He cared about workers' rights. He was a radical activist. History remembers him fondly as an undercover journalist. So what is journalism? Well, it's not an identity, it's an activity. It's what you are what you repeatedly do. They can call me criminal, activist, traitor, I doctor tape, but you are what you do. You are what you do. And at Veritas, we're doing what people used to do. It's sort of like a renaissance. People criticize Project Veritas for having an agenda. I've met with President Trump a few times. That's been reported. I don't know if Ken Vogel's here in the audience, the New York Times guy, reported on that. But we kind of share a synergy with the president, who believes in circumventing the mainstream media. Lincoln Stevens visited the office of Teddy Roosevelt. He was a muckraker many times during the Reform movement. Upton Sinclair had a radical workers' rights agenda, as I said. People tried to discredit Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. He actually opened up a press office and ran it for 6 months, countering these attacks. But they set out to destroy him, but the cracks had formed in the dam of media. And then you look at other reporters throughout the 20th century, people at the Chicago Sun-Times. William Gaines dressed up as a janitor and was told by the hospital to help in performing surgery. So his piece, Lives Held in Grimy Hands, he posed as a janitor and they made him do surgery. So for this deception, William Gaines won a Pulitzer Prize. They may criticize our ethics, but falsehood spread from the podium and from those who speak on the record, and that creates oftentimes a greater harm to society. When you blindly report what your sources tell you without questioning them, as I just read those headlines about the Twitter investigation, that's also deception, is it not? Where is the virtue in passing along untrue information to the masses? So we go undercover to deceive our targets in order to tell the truth to the people, because the most vital and necessary function is to tell the truth to the people. And then came Watergate, at least from my reading, and I write about in this book, And then came Watergate, and something happened in journalism. Something happened. Nixon's personalities and tendencies and frame of mind opened up the private life to public scrutiny, which now has become a complete perversion in journalism. Elevated practitioners of investigative journalism developed a sort of hero worship cult complex of Woodward and Bernstein that you see today. It moved journalism away from description and towards prescription. Fear and guilt to lose on the next scoop, the next big one, left without fear or favor to become a pursuit of power. Journalists get involved to become powerful now, not to chase facts. And this wasn't new. People did this before, I guess. I write about the fact that they protected FDR from being photographed in his wheelchair. Even Ben Bradley protected JFK to a degree. And people cherish myths and want to worship heroes, and oftentimes they cannot handle the truth. You know, I don't know if the public wants to hear the truth sometimes, but I'll get to that in a minute. Stereotypes have to become reinforced. And in Breakthrough, I tell the story about going undercover into the Hillary Clinton campaign. In this book, I follow up. We spent a year, 12 people, undercover in the campaign. This young woman named Allison, she got burned once, she dyed her hair, and she lived the life for months. Rode the subway to work, got into Bob Creamer's office, and we had all these tapes of them inciting violence at Trump rallies, talking about committing voter fraud, talking about committing sort of money laundering, taking money from one group to the next group and disguising it through a series of blind trusts. We had these videos, and last year we brought them to major corporations, major news organizations. It was a big story, and everyone told me that. And at the very last minute, the stories were spiked by all of these major media organizations. They wouldn't tell me at the time, but after the videos came out and President Trump used them in the debate, you can read all about this in this book, we were the only videos used in the presidential debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. After that happened, these large media organizations told me the reason they spiked the stories, get this, they feared a Hillary Clinton administration revoking their FCC broadcast licenses. And I had this moment in my office where I thought, I can't believe it. We're just a rinky-dink nonprofit group in Westchester, New York, and the billion-dollar media corporations are afraid of Hillary Clinton? Well, then what, should I be afraid of Hillary Clinton? Yes, no, maybe, we'll get to that. So, people resigned, Creamer resigned, Scott Vogel resigned, Trump talks about us, the videos become a phenomenon, the biggest story in the history of Project Veritas, bigger than the Acorn videos. Everyone in this room played a certain part, whether it was giving $100 or $1,000 or tweeting the videos. And partially, guys, this is economics, right? It's not all politics. The main, and we talk about in the book, Bob Creamer visited the White House 47 times and met with the president personally, Obama 47 times. So this brave young woman, Allison, represents what many of our reporters go through. They spend weeks, if not months, alone in the field, alone, away from their family, in hotel rooms, putting their lives on the line. And these people in the media should be ashamed of themselves because they wake up, probably here in Manhattan, a lot of them, get into a limousine, go to their offices, go to the 40th floor, read off a teleprompter, go back to their apartments, while my journalists are out in the field, literally, sometimes risking their lives to do this. Their skins, their names, their reputations. You know what it feels like to be burned? It hurts. It's not me that gets burned, it's my colleagues. And they know that, and they know for the rest of their life when they get Googled, they may never get a job. And that's the price they pay. And what I've learned is that people are more willing to give up their lives than their reputations in this country, and that's scary. That's just scary. So why give people the truth? Why engage in this fight? One of my heroes, a man named Alexander Solzhenitsyn, said, "Live not by lies." He called the press in Western countries, this was in 1978 at Harvard University. He gave a speech. He started by saying, veritas, the Latin word for truth. He said, the press is more powerful than all three branches of government. The press is more powerful than the executive, judicial, and legislative branch, is what he said. Why? Because politics is downstream from culture. Culture is downstream from data, and as Stefan sort of alluded to, data is downstream from information and journalism. So one of the most poignant parts of this book is where I talk about Solzhenitsyn. And did you ever notice, by the way, how there's no video from the Soviet Union? There's no video of the gulags. Video makes things more real. But what happens in a society where people lose their will to fight, they lose their will, and I worry in this country because I give these talks, and the first question I get asked is, am I afraid? Do I fear for my life? Am I fear the IRS? And I worry that there's a deeper theme in our country, and when I write about in this book, where people we're developing a country filled with sort of feckless cowards, afraid to buck the system. Betrayal has become a form of existence. I've seen it. I know that you've seen it too. People will seek praise from the mainstream media and use any opportunity to get it. And I see it in my fight with the mainstream press. Sometimes people sell out their friends at the slightest misstep because nothing is more favorable than being favored by them. Taken to the extreme, people are utterly unwilling to stand up for their own principles because they fear the humiliating power of the press so much. The dreaded CNN Chiron, which for the last week has been S-hole. The entire week has been S-hole. Like there's nothing else going on in the world, and everyone's chasing around the soccer ball on the field talking about the same damn thing. And there comes Veritas talking about Twitter, and they almost turn around to talk about Twitter. Well, imagine a world where there was 1,000 guerrilla journalists, and we were all forcing them to talk about other things. That's our vision. And we know that journalists move in packs, like a soccer ball on a field or like a blackbirds on a telephone wire. It gets to the point where the vast majority of journalists are all talking about the same thing. If we're not careful to resist this, we'll end up as a nation of cowards. I write in American Pravda, I fear that our country, I quote Marcus Luttrell, who says that our war is here. It's not overseas, it's here. That's what he said. I'm quoting him. And we must have a free press. So to quote Ben Bradley, if we don't hold them accountable, who will? Every act of resistance to the government requires heroism quite out of proportion to the magnitude of the act. Matt Tieremann, who introduced Stefan, his father was a revolutionary. Tieremann Sr., who said the quality of the revolutionary is inversely proportional to the system he fights against. The more oppressive and cruel the regime, the more heroic and self-sacrificing the rebel. So when Katie Couric asked Sarah Palin, what newspapers do you read? It's not exactly Cronkite journalism, but she gets the prize. I'm not going to lie to you. The path for Project Veritas is a difficult one. We right now have our heels dug in, and we are being brutally and viciously assaulted by our media and by our justice system. We have some 12 lawsuits against us in both state and federal court. I have to make an appearance next week in federal court against Bob Kramer, who's suing us for tortious interference and trespass. He's wrong, but I have to go to court. We have 15 law firms employed to defend us in these actions. We have the California and the New York Attorney General's office coming after us hard. And we have many in the local New York media celebrating the fact that the New York Attorney General is coming after our independent nonprofit organization. And suddenly the media is giving us a lecture in Truth to Power with all these commercials about bananas and apples and he said, she said, truth, through the New York Times. They believe what they're doing is righteous, but it's really groupthink. And I say to these reporters what I told Michelle Malkin is, where the hell were you over the last 5 years, 6 years? My colleagues in New Hampshire were faced criminal grand jury subpoenas. Where were you? They raided their homes. Where were you when they raided the home of David Daleiden? They raided his home. The California Attorney General took his hard drives with AR-15s. Where were you when my 3 colleagues were arrested in New Orleans? What we said we were waiting for someone when we were not. It was that flippant comment that gave us 3 years of federal probation with hard labor on the Appalachian Trail. Where were you? Where were you? 4 years ago, we were living in a garage with a MacBook and a dream. We were told, not only by our enemies, but by our friends, well, you're on your own. Literally, it was me and a guy sleeping on a floor in a garage, while the Attorney General of New Hampshire, whose name, I can't make this up, is Richard Head, Dick Head, was coming after us with these criminal grand jury subpoenas. Can't make it up. So, Joy Reid attacked our charitable fundraising solicitation of people giving us $10, saying, "Are you a registered charity? Are you fundraising off Amazon Smile?" Many of these people in corporate media have no sense of irony. The irony of these companies, they do profit breaks every 10 minutes to promote pharmaceutical companies. They're called commercials. And we raise money and they attack us. If there's one virtue about where we stand today, it's that the Trump administration is doing one thing very well. He's raising awareness to the most important thing, I think, in modern times. And that's the corruption and the disingenuousness and the flippantness of our press and the ability to circumvent them. If we have one vision for this country, it is for the citizens to enter what Teddy Roosevelt called the arena. It is for them to have the moral courage required to not fear the humiliating power of the press, because there are things more important than praise in the mainstream media. Truth does not always get you praised. But we must summon what my mentor and friend years ago, Andrew Breitbart, called righteous indignation. Righteous indignation, not merely at the individual tragedy, but also at the moral disorder and the social breakdowns that tragedy represents. We can create this journalism of outrage that sort of brings people together. I have to say, the Twitter story brought people together. I don't think anybody wants Twitter logging through your personal text messages to your wife and girlfriend. I don't think people want that. Video, audio have the power to cut through, to circumvent, to transfix, to catalyze things, to make them more real. And we will reach that threshold of outrage that empowers a free people based on the truth. Through video, I believe that we can reach a turning point in our country, and that's what I write about in this book, because I've seen it. I've seen it. I've seen it defund groups, change laws despite criminal grand jury subpoenas. I've seen people's minds changed after watching these videos. I've seen people inspired. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people send us messages. Please come to Wichita, Kansas. Please come to Seattle. Please come to the Upper West Side of Manhattan and expose this guy, because there's no one else doing it. So through this, we can potentially dent the fortress, just dent it, and crack the dam until eventually the water pours over. Now, in closing, I'll say this. We receive, the philosopher in me, much like Stefan, we receive information by way of our senses. That's how we perceive the world. The gift of reason enables us to filter this information through our own experience and the collective wisdom of our past, which together constitutes common sense. It seems like there is little of that these days on the chyron of CNN. It's almost like the major media outlets don't want you to trust your own common sense. They say, don't look at that man behind the curtain. Don't trust your eyes and ears. George Orwell wrote in 1984, which was the year I was born, ironically enough, that the most important thing, the establishment, the most important order from the establishment is to disobey the evidence of your eyes and ears. Observed protagonist Winston Smith, it is their most essential commandment, to disobey your own senses, to disobey your own vision. Now, in this book, I dedicate it to my grandfather, James O'Keefe Sr. My grandfather was so good at improvising and using recycled materials. He almost never had to make a purchase. He would salvage neighbors' shingles, find old cabinets on the side of the road, unused copper pipe from subcontractors at the Elks Club, scavenge bricks in fields, and use them to make pathways. He would drive around at night, finding furniture, and would rebuild wood chairs using glue and screws that were never even the same color. He would quite literally build things out of nothing. Out of nothing. And how inspirational was that? And make the end product more ergonomical, useful, and beautifully designed than the stuff you can even buy at Home Depot. In fact, one time, he made me climb into a dumpster to get wood that we would build a barn with. And it was the most amazing thing. In other words, my grandfather did the impossible. And he was told by everyone that it couldn't be done. He was told by people in the town that it couldn't be done. And he did it anyway. He did it anyway. So I say, let's do the impossible. Let's show the people that we can bring the information out. Let's allow people to evaluate information for themselves. Let's inform a free people. Let's inform the people of this country, because content is king. Veritas!